I hope you all had wonderful conversations with one another that you're going to want to continue another day, another time period. What you just did was to engage in what we talk about when we talk about humble inquiry. So you asked a question that you didn't know the answer to, and you were encouraged to sit and just listen to what you heard. And so that's part of what we've been exercising in these mini Pulpit Plus exchange moments. So welcome, everybody. I didn't start with the welcome, but welcome. I'm glad to see you all. And if you only knew how full my heart is every time I see you on a Monday. Mondays are really the highlight of my experience here at Iliff School of Theology, and it's because of you and because of the work that we've been doing together. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are excited that you brought your curiosity this evening, and hopefully that you also brought some of your tenderness for the ways in which we're going to delve into intergenerational healing tonight. And we have a really wonderful person who's going to help us to engage that. This year, you know that we were inspired by Fannie Lou Hamer, Emma Lazarus, and several other ancestors who noticed that the only way to obtain true freedom for an individual was to seek that freedom for every single person. And so that is what inspired us to have the How We All Get Free series. And as many of you know, each speaker, each facilitator, each conversation has hopefully presented a new insight for you into what freedom looks like for everyone. We can't have everyone here, but we've tried to have people from diverse social locations to present their opinions, their viewpoints, their experiences on the matter. And so as a part of us getting free, we also know the importance of truth-telling. And in telling that truth at Iliff, one of the things that we have continued to enact in our speech, in our thinking, and hopefully in our actions is the truth-telling about our land acknowledgement. Iliff School of Theology, founded in 1892, acknowledges that the space in which we gather today is located in the ancestral home of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. The people closely associated with the founding of Iliff caused a devastation that we cannot undo or fully rectify. And our intertwined history makes us responsible for all Indigenous peoples in our continued occupation of this land. We now acknowledge the enduring relationships that these nations have to their homeland. We acknowledge that our occupancy has historically ignored the relational significance of the land and all of its peoples, both human and non-human. Through this acknowledgement, we pledge in our learning community to listen to, learn from, to amplify the wisdom of, and find opportunities to partner with the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. In addition to our land acknowledgement, we publicly affirm our commitment to the Lenape peoples with whom we have entered into an ongoing process of accountability and building right relationships. The intertwined histories of Methodism and Euro-Christian conquest were exemplified by welcoming the gift of an 18th century book of Christian history bound in the flayed and tanned skin of a murdered Lenape man and publicly displayed at Iliff as a treasured artifact from 1893 until 1974. We seek to address this horrific legacy through attention and sustained effort to reshape Iliff's relationship with the Lenape and other Indigenous peoples in our teaching and communal life. We are profoundly grateful to the Lenape peoples for their willingness to engage with Iliff as we wrestle with this painful history and pledge to uphold this relationship in good faith. We pledge to be accountable to all Indigenous peoples and to build relationships grounded in justice, respect, and shared responsibility. Let's take a moment to think through this. And now I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker, Serene Thin Elk. Serene Thin Elk is an enrolled member of the Yankton Sioux tribe of South Dakota. She is the director of Indigenous Mindfulness at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and is a licensed addiction and mental health clinician with 20 years of experience in the mental health field. She holds a master's degree from Lesley University in expressive therapies, which focuses on utilizing various art forms within the therapeutic process to guide others in their healing journey. She has developed and facilitated cultural, clinical, and community-based programming within urban, rural, and tribal communities. She is passionate about addressing patterns of intergenerational transmission and finding ways to help individuals, families, and communities heal from the effects of historical traumas. She resides in Minnesota with her children and husband in the homelands of the Dakotas and Anishinaabe people. Please welcome Serene Thin Elk to the podium.
I almost said good morning. I'm coming from a different time zone. Thank you so much for that awesome welcome. And I'm really, really excited to be here tonight. Like she said, I'm from South Dakota. That's where my people are from. Some of our people are exiled from the Minnesota, what we now call Minnesota Territory, down to the South Dakota Territory. So my tribe is now in Ihangtuan Territory. That's what we call ourselves. And village dwellers is how that's translated, but it's known as the Yankton Sioux tribe. Then my dad is also from South Dakota. He's Lakota. He's Sichagu, known as the Rosebud Sioux tribe. I'm gonna greet you all in my language. Chante washte nape chuzape, Serene Thin Elk. My name is Serene Thin Elk, and I greet you all with a good heart and a handshake is what that translates to. And we have a lot of protocols and teachings within our tribal communities. And I do want to note that a lot of people don't know how vast and varied our tribal communities are, that we have well over 350 different languages in different areas, different cultural protocols, spiritual practices. And so I always like to note that, one, I'm coming here as an individual, as a mother, wife, daughter, professional, human being, to express my thoughts on something that is very, very important in today's society, to understand how intergenerational patterns deeply, deeply impact who we are today. So I'd like to always just say that because, sometimes when you're the only Native person in the room, there's this feeling that it's like, okay, tell us how all Natives feel. Tell us all the answers. Tell us how to be a good ally. Give us and it's like, I don't have the answers for all that, but I am here to share from my heart and from my mind some of the experiences I've had in my own personal journey and also in my professional journey being a therapist. I just want to express again that I'm really grateful to be here, and LinkedIn is a wonderful place. And that's where, she found me and we connected. And I'm really excited to be here. And like she said, acknowledging the tribal people that are here, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Ute. I was here about a month ago doing an oral history project with boarding school survivors through the organization I work through. And a lot of the people who came to interview and tell their stories of surviving the boarding schools, the federal Indian boarding schools, were Lakota. And for those of you who don't know the history, there's the Indian Relocation Act, and our people were relocated off of the reservations and paid to go work in urban settings. So a lot of our people are kind of all over the place in different cities across the U.S. So it felt like home to be here in a way, even though these aren't our homelands, to know that a lot of my people, a lot of our people are here as well. So I have a clicker here. Let me grab my clicker. So today is going to be a combination of, we're going to start out with just kind of defining things so that we can all kind of be in a shared mind space. There's a lot more context to a lot of these definitions, but because of time, I feel like just giving a general description of some of these things would be helpful. I do know that some people know a lot of the history, Native history in terms of colonization and genocide and all of that, but I never assume that every person in the room knows. And it's really important to revisit that every time, just in case there is someone who has questions and doesn't quite understand the history that they too come from. Um, so, okay, so I like to start with in the clinical world, we call it a strength-based intervention or methodology, but in the cultural world, we call it spirit. And so the medicine wheel, if we look at each being, each community, the earth, the universe, everything is seen as being interconnected, every single thing. So we do not see ourselves as separate, better than, or less than anything else that exists in this universe. So this medicine wheel is a representation of so many teachings that even I don't know most of them, but I know some of them. How I like to use this medicine wheel and talking about it and bringing teachings is that there are 4 quadrants in this. It's mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual. And those different colors represent different directions. And there's actually 7 directions, but the medicine wheel, when you look at it, you see the 4 directions, right? It goes the different ways. But if you also include the sky and then the earth, and then we ourselves, each of us are the 7th direction. And so when you look at this as an individual's experience, in the middle is the 7th direction. And the 7th direction is a part of everything in the universe and is a place where everything and every being is whole and interconnected. No matter what happens in our lives, in our paths, we are whole at the core of our being. This can be a really beautiful assessment tool for ourselves to check in with ourselves and try to build awareness of how might I not be paying attention to one area in my life? Maybe I'm really good at spirituality, prayer, and that gives me a strong mind, but have I been taking care of my body? So it's a reflection tool with many teachings. And again, this is more from my area. I don't know how many other tribes really use a medicine wheel in their teachings, but this is from Lakota Dakota territory. Something else that's really important as we're understanding Indigenous perspective is that we're always balancing 2 realms very strongly. So one of them is the Wakan in our language, which means sacred. So the sacred is the connection to the source and where everything is whole and interconnected. It's something that's our people almost see it as like a mystery, the great mystery that we don't pretend to have all of the answers to everything, but we do know that there are miracles that happen. And by miracles, the breath of life, new life, someone passing on and journeying on to the spirit world or to heaven or whatever you refer to it to. All of these experiences as a human are miracles. even through the suffering and the pain. And so we know that everything is sacred. And then we're always balancing that with our human journey. We say unchi maka, so our connection to Grandmother Earth and to ourselves. And um, what that does when we are aware every day, um, some of the daily practices that we're taught to do, I don't always do so well at doing them if I have a lot going on in my life, but some of those daily practices are going outside and offering food, offering tobacco, acknowledging the different directions, acknowledging the trees. When you do that, you realize that you are never alone, even when you may feel lost in grief or lost in your life or angry or sad or going through something really difficult. You realize that I'm never ever alone. There's such an interdependence of all life. And so to know that spiritual realm is always equal. It's not something that um, in our ways, we don't believe that someone has to believe and practice a certain way to find liberation, to find healing. We know that every single person is unique in the circle, has a gift in the circle. And I love that question of what is your gift? Because many times we can see it in other people, but we minimize it in ourselves. And to be able to recognize that we are sacred, no matter, again, no matter what has happened to us or what we may have done to others, that source of who we are is always present. So having those two things is a part of Indigenous perspective. Moving into intergenerational trauma and healing, um, I want to talk a little bit about this word trauma. In the DSM-5, it's changed, but previously, and for the DSM-5, for those of you who don't know, it's a diagnostic statistical manual, and it's used to diagnose people with mental health diagnoses. So I think it's a very problematic thing, and it also absolutely can help people to understand at this point in history with all of the changes that have happened, especially for our people through colonization, it can feel liberating to get a diagnosis of something that maybe you didn't know was causing you problems, your whole life, right? And there being treatment. But the other side of that is that it's very defined and boxed in. And so in the past, trauma was kind of set aside or talked about for people who are veterans or have been through war or basically life or death situations. And those are the obvious ones. But the ones that aren't talked about very much and starting to be understood more is that trauma is really an intricacy of your nervous system and your brain working together in your response to an event. And so you can have two people go through the same event and have very, very different responses. Now, we can't invalidate that other person's experience and say, well, you didn't go through something really terrible or your life wasn't at risk. But now what we're understanding is it's the person's response to the event. So, for example, domestic violence in the home, a child may hear something, and that can be very, very psychologically traumatic for them. And so, as we're defining trauma, we're looking at it kind of on a spectrum of human experience. And through the Native perspective, when we're referring to intergenerational pain, we talk about blood memory. So the blood memory is a spiritual and collective memory of our ancestors. So it's not only our life experiences, but it's what's in our DNA, it's referred to as epigenetics, and how their experiences are very much alive within us. And so that's both healing and traumatic. And then I always like to raise up Dr. Eduardo Duran and Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. They are amazing Indigenous psychologists who have brought so much research and understanding to this field of helping that is not just through a westernized view anymore. We talk a lot about how the tools of the oppressor are not the same tools that are going to help our people to find that healing and to feel liberated. And so we have to, within our own communities, in our own bodies, in our own beings, come to know, what does liberation look like for me? What does healing look like for me and for my family? And yes, some of those clinical tools do help. They have helped me in my life a great deal. But for our people, we talk about the healing coming from the spirit. What nourishes your spirit every day? It's like a spark of life and a fire that you tend to at all times. And so being able to recognize that concepts like the soul wound, they look deeper than just what's happening with your brain. And intergenerational trauma, it's a transmission of trauma from one generation to the next. So we know that through a lot of research, and also just all of us in lived experience know that it can happen behaviorally and biologically. So the biological part is the epigenetics. There is Dr. Rachel Yehuda. I don't know if anyone has heard of her work, but she's done amazing research in epigenetics about different intergenerational transmission for folks who went through the Holocaust, and even 2 generations after the effects of that, and symptoms that aren't their own based upon any of their own experiences, but very, very much related to the Holocaust that some of their lineage went through. And it's the same for Native people. We have lots of stories about that. So biologically, but then behaviorally, I'll give you an example. So if you are in a home, the closest thing I can think of right now, because the stories are so present with me, are the boarding school survivors that we worked with. And I'm going to get into boarding school here in just a moment for those of you who don't know what I'm referring to. But if they were taken away at very young ages, as young as 4, taken from their family, it was a U.S. federal policy through the government to be able to take Native children, Indian children from their families, called the Civilization Act. And then they were taken away to these schools. Well, they called them schools. They're really imprisonment camps. They had to cut their hair, just on and on. They weren't allowed to speak their language. Their religion, Christianity, was forced upon them. And they didn't see their parents, and many, many, many of them experienced abuse on every level, not just spiritual abuse, physical, sexually, emotional, mental. So in the clinical world, we call that complex grief, complex PTSD. And so they experienced all of these things as children. So imagine going to this school without your identity, without your culture, without your family. And then once you graduate, you're going out into the world. No one taught you how to parent. No one taught you what we call like healthy attachment theory, how you attach in healthy ways to your children. And so behaviorally, a descendant of a boarding school survivor learns certain things about how to survive. The child doesn't know that they're learning these things, but they're learning how to survive. They're sort of emulating the behaviors that they see of their parents. So although that descendant did not go through the same boarding school experience, very often you see that even 3rd generation removed, finally that person might be starting to do some of the healing. And so that's the behavioral response in addition to the biological. So this picture is one that's often used, and it's always really, really hard for me to see and really look at the faces of these little babies, these children that were taken. But again, I mentioned Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, and she defines historical trauma, which is different than intergenerational trauma. They can both be happening at the same time, but historical trauma is very specific, and that's a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan across generations, emanating from massive group trauma. So for Indigenous people, the massive group trauma started at the beginning of colonization for our people in the 1400s. And so, it's been over 500 years of this pattern. Very specifically, the boarding school era, you hear it referring to that. So it's the Civilization Fund Act. And this era, as they call it, ran from 1860 to 1978. Boarding schools are still, there are a lot of schools that are still running, but they have made changes since then. So that's a lot of questions people have. Are these schools still happening? And if so, are changes being made? And so there are some that are still the original names and all of that, but a lot of them have not, no, are no longer going. So this just refers back to the epigenetics that I talked to. And the thing that's really powerful about this, I'm sure some of you have heard about like neuroplasticity and the ability for us to heal in our brain and our bodies and our spirit, even in the face of things like PTSD. And so I always like to say that because it's here, she talks about it not being a biological prison, right? Like this happened to my parents and therefore it was handed down to me. It's more about being curious about some of our own automatic reactions as human beings in our relationships, even how we treat ourselves, and being curious about were some of these patterns handed down to me? Maybe some of these thoughts I have about myself, the world, my relationships, perhaps they're not my own. Maybe they came from a fear-based perspective of survival before I was even born, right? So being curious about that and knowing that we can change that. Um, when we're talking about historical trauma responses, and again, this is applicable, this research here was done in Lakota country, where I'm from, by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. But I would venture to say, and I can't quote that because I don't know that other research with other places in the world, but that a lot of these are probably really similar across the world. So hypervigilance, for those of you who don't know what hypervigilance is it's this automatic response that happens according to some sort of trigger. So it may be a loud noise, it may be a smell, it can be something, and what happens is your body literally will flinch, and it's to protect yourself. And I'd like to use that as an example because with trauma and the way that things are wired, especially as children, those patterns can follow us into a lifetime. And we have often a lot of people will carry a lot of shame about these automatic responses that were hardwired into us at a young age. So, for example, someone maybe that you hear, everyone's probably heard of fight or flight mode. Like when I'm really upset, I tend to run, leave a situation, walk away. I'm not dealing with it. That's it. And maybe people around you say, why do you always do that? Why do you always walk away? Or there's someone in your life that does that. And it becomes this negative, like, reaction to that trauma response or to that anxiety response. Because I know it's not all trauma, right? But we're looking at it through a traumatic lens. So I really invite people to one of the most powerful tools in healing through trauma and creating those new neural pathways and rebuilding and repairing relationships is to truly slow down and ask yourself, try to destigmatize it within yourself of those things that you do and ask yourself, are there things that I could do in the moment to interrupt that pattern? Are there things that I can do to make those patterns last for a shorter duration of time? So in a counseling session, when someone talks about hypervigilance, sometimes that's perceived by family members or people in our life as rejection, like, oh, you're scared of me, or why don't you want to touch me? And then that person feels bad. So education awareness is the very, very first step. Destigmatizing your own reaction to your reaction, kind of saying, how can I take a look at this and try to find ways to nurture myself through this and make changes? Very often fixation to trauma. So one of the main components of trauma is replaying things over and over. And it's the brain's way of trying to resolve what happened and trying to come to a better result over and over. Therefore, the brain's saying, I don't want this to ever happen again. So let's replay this over and over and over and think about what you could have done differently. And so that's a really normal response. Somatic symptoms, that's things that come up in your body, survivor guilt, anger, and psychic numbing. So as you can see, some really, really hard things. When you think about a lot of what our people are facing today, it's not only the internal experience of some of these things, it's also the external oppression and the systems that were not designed at all for our people. They just weren't. In fact, most of them were designed to repress us. So we wouldn't have a voice. So we wouldn't have our culture. We wouldn't have our language. We wouldn't have our family systems in place. And so it's not only the internal experience, it's also the external. And so it's very complex and it's a lot. It's a lot on our people. Okay. So as we're talking about trauma, one of the most important things in terms of healing is relationship. So it can be relationship to others, it can be relationship to nature, it can be relationship, being able to find healthy exploration of relationship. So as we talk about, I'm going to use another kind of example. Again, a little bit of storytelling weave throughout this to give more context and personalization. So let's take someone who has been through the boarding schools and may have been, experienced a lot of different traumas and abuses. When they come out and they're adults and they're trying to have their own families, no one really has taught them what is trauma, what is abuse, what are healthy relationships, what are healthy boundaries. Those are things that just aren't taught. So what ends up happening is something called codependency in the clinical world. And what this can bring, I think a lot of times when people think of codependency, they think of like, oh, two people who are so dependent upon each other. Or like you see a young couple that's just, so in love and like can't be apart. People are like, they're so codependent. That's actually not what codependency is. Codependency is often feeling like a really strong lack of self. And because of your own wounds or belief systems, you end up trying to fix other people in order to feel a sense of self, to feel valued, to feel like you have a purpose. And I speak from experience with this. And I see a lot of our people struggle with this, but there's a nuance to this with Indigenous people that isn't acknowledged fully or talked about with that, is that the pain of generations of mothers and fathers, but very, very specifically mothers having their children taken away from them and placed in boarding schools, generations of that. Can you imagine the wounds, the mother wound of not feeling completely powerless, not knowing if your child is okay, all of those things. And a lot of our children who went to boarding school from our communities did pass away. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, the mass graves that are being found. And there are a lot of communities that are having kind of bringing home those babies, bringing home those children that left and never came back. And I always get emotional when I talk about that because again, I can feel it somatically in my body. I can feel the grief of mothers. I can feel those things. And so codependency in the clinical world, we also call it enmeshment, where maybe you don't have healthy boundaries and you're always trying to either hover or be a part of something. And it's really, really important, I think, for especially our Native women to recognize that that wound goes deeper than some of our own wounds that we have had in our life. There's a story of mothers who have their children have been taken away, and it's an experience, and also to fathers in their role as fathers. And so it's complex and compounded. And I share a lot of these examples because I think a lot of people tend to look at Indigenous people through a very, like there is no education on who we are as human beings. It's more like we're either in the past, right? All the times I've traveled and people have said to me, are you Native American? Your last name sounds Native American. Wow, I thought you guys were all gone. I didn't know you guys still existed. I mean, like comments like this, all the way to people who completely romanticize our ways of life, our spirituality. And I think some of them might have good intentions, but it's really, really dehumanizing on either end of the spectrum because you're sort of looking at us as these caricatures of what is portrayed through media and limited information, right? There's no true history. I'm gonna say no, very little true history of our people, what happened to us, and also the gifts that we have. So the ability to heal intergenerationally, although I'm talking about Native people, the ability to heal and to look at some of these patterns that have developed through our own traumas and also be curious about how did maybe my grandma do this, or how did my mom, maybe her own wounds carry over to me. And when I say that doing that work is hard, I know because I see myself, the beauty and the strength of my mom as a Dakota woman. I see that in myself, and it makes me feel strong. In fact, I bring the matriarch energy with me in my thoughts and in my heart. Every time before I get up to speak and share, I get so nervous. I'm sitting in the back thinking, oh man, I don't know this. It's different when you walk into a new community with people and you don't know people. But I just closed my eyes and I said a prayer and I thought of them and I thought, no, it's okay. This is storytelling. This is storytelling and connecting to other humans. There's nothing to be worried about. And so that matriarch energy is strong. And I also see that there are generations that had to survive and remained in survival mode because of conditioning of what a man was told he should be, or conditioning of what women were told they should be, and the boxes that they should be in. There was repression, there was all of that on top of some of these traumatic things that happen. So I used to think when I was early on, like in my 20s, doing a lot of this, I was sort of like picking apart, oh man, then this is a negative pattern that I see in my family or in my community. And now I look at those almost as strengths, and that they were able to survive through some of the hardest things that I can't even imagine. And the fact that they did brings me to where I am, where I can look a little deeper being the next generation. I don't have to be in constant survival mode as a Native woman. I don't have to carry that same heaviness and reactivity and protecting myself everywhere I go because of what my mother and my grandmother did to keep our ceremonies alive, to keep our language alive, and to raise a family. And so being able to recognize that sometimes in our relationships and historical trauma, there is this like misunderstanding of like, what's a healthy boundary? I don't know. Like you get so wrapped up in trying to help and fix people. And I'm also an addictions therapist. I think that was mentioned too, but codependency in the addiction world it can be a very real thing where if there's somebody that you love with all you have, a family member, a friend, who is suffering and struggling, and we know that addiction it has a spirit. The way our people think of addiction is like it has a spirit. And if that spirit is taking over and raging and like, their thought patterns and all of that, then it's a normal response to want to fix and provide resources and treatment and all of these things. And at some point in the process, there comes a point of surrendering and recognizing that we don't have any control over anyone else's patterns or behaviors. And so in our families as Native people, we struggle with addiction. We struggle with mental health. We struggle with having access to resources that can help us. And we struggle with those things because of the things that have happened to us. And now I see our generation and the ones even after, my kids, my daughter's 17 and she has a strong voice. I mean, she will point out things and say things, and I'm like, I would have never, when I was her age. And so the more that we work on ourselves, we're able to help our youth and even ourselves to understand some of these dynamics that aren't healthy and that they actually come from a lot of our own traumas, grief, and wounds. So, how do we heal? Again, like I said in the beginning, nobody has the complete answer to that. Everyone has their own personal journey of healing and what it looks like. But we do know as Native people that acts of resistance are crucial. As I talked about the external world, a lot of the systems that are there, colonial systems that are there, if we didn't have our ancestors stand up, fight back, use their voices, um, strategize about how do we keep our people safe. If we didn't resist those things that were happening, we wouldn't be here today. I literally would not be alive if they didn't resist. And so acts of resistance from the very beginning, all the way to people who are language keepers, and that is their form of resistance, all the way to people who are lobbying for, different bills to be passed for our people so we get recognition. The highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives are amongst Indigenous people. Then the coverage is limited to nothing at all. It's rampant, right? And so I'm sharing that because there are a lot of people who are actively resisting that and saying, I lost my mother. She went missing and no one ever cared. She was never looked for. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to lobby. I'm going to do what I need to. So resistance in all forms, whether it's someone at home that's caring for your children and helping them to feel secure attachments at home so they can have healthy relationships in the future, that's an act of resistance. Acknowledging the grief and pain that lives within us individually and collectively. So the reason why it's really important to highlight individually and collectively is that I don't know how many of you can relate, but when you come from a community, a people who have gone through so much hurt and loss together, you not only feel your hurt and pain, you feel the pain of everyone else. And that's why I think there's so much shared context amongst our people that we know that we have struggled through a lot of the same things. Now, the really interesting and hard part is balancing that. If you are grieving on your own, and also amongst other people who are grieving or going through a hard time, we have to learn when do we step back from the collective and focus on our own healing path? How and when do we do that? And I always tell people you can tell when you need to do that when you start to feel depleted, when what we say now, your nervous system, like maybe you're feeling a lot of anxiety, you're overwhelmed, you're depleted. Those are, listen to your body. Your body does not lie. It will always guide you home to yourself, to that source, to that seventh direction. So acknowledging that great grief and pain, because again, we can't change what we don't acknowledge, aren't aware of. We're just sort of walking around with this heaviness. And some of the hardest parts of healing are acknowledging the pain. Recently, I had another story to share, a talk with a sister, a dear sister of mine, a sister friend. In Native way, close friends we call them sisters. And we were both talking about going through some things, mistakes that we made as parents when our children are little or teenagers, and the deep pain of having to confront that and taking accountability for that and listening to our children when they do share with us and not going directly into a shame spiral or a defensive mode, but just listening with your whole heart. And so acknowledging it, right? We're acknowledging that not just in ourselves, but also our family members. Our ceremonial lifeways and cultural identity as healing, and recognizing that our lifeways are medicine and what, the Western world calls treatment. And we call it really healing, like a healing focused intention for ourselves and our people. I want to share an example of this this combination of ceremonial ways, culture with, I guess you'd say, modern day Western medicine. So a lot of the research shows that there's something called bilateral stimulation. And so there's a treatment for people who have psychological trauma. It's called EMDR. And you kind of expose yourself in your memory, you talk through some of the hard things that happen, and there's someone that leads your eyes back and forth. And they walk you through this whole process. It's a very intricate but powerful process. And what they found is the rates of healing and sustained healing and letting go of some of those symptoms, or at least having them be less in intensity and frequency, has come from bilateral stimulation. So again, with the eyes, sometimes it's with sound. You can even kind of tap back and forth, because what you're doing is you're literally activating the different parts of your brain and sometimes bringing the ones online again, like your frontal lobe, that helps you to think a little bit clearly. It slows down your heart rate. So there's a science to it, right? Well, in our ways of life, the drum is the heartbeat of our people. And that isn't, I remember my dad saying when I was little, I used to go around when he would talk, and I remember him saying, the drum is not a symbol of the heartbeat of our people. The drum is the literal heartbeat of our people. Without the drum, the ceremony begins when the drum is there. It is the heartbeat. It's the first thing that a child hears in their mother's body, is that heartbeat. And we have that medicine outside as well. That drum is a gift that was given to the people from Creator to Ngashila, higher power. And so anytime that we're coming together to celebrate, to grieve, part of our mourning ceremonies, all of those things, the heartbeat sustains everyone. And that heartbeat goes into our literal hearts. I was talking to someone earlier about, she plays the violin, and we were talking about the waves of the violin and how I said it goes straight to my heart. I can literally feel like sometimes music. And so we have different ways to get through grief, protocols that have been well established goes back as far as probably as humans, that we existed as Indigenous people. And so the things that are coming to be seen in science are powerful tools. They're teaching us a lot. They're giving us grounding and tools. And there are things that our people have always done to heal, to move through life, even through suffering. It doesn't take away the suffering. It helps us to move through the suffering collectively. And another example of that is different dancing, right? Like the bilateral, the stepping, it literally sends messages to your brain. The rhythm is calming, it brings balance. There's a theory out there called the polyvagal theory, and it has a lot to do with being able to activate a part of your nervous system to calm you. And it has a lot to do with digestion, and you start to notice it when you do these polyvagal exercises. And so I've lost two siblings. I have many siblings. And two of them, older than me, have passed away. And the most recent one is my sister, who passed away. And after she left and, journeyed home, something changed within me. And it was a different type of grief that I could have never. I grieved for my brother. He was my best friend. But it was something about losing her at that time in my life where I fell completely apart. And there's no amount of tools as a therapist, there's no amount of support even that could have taken me out of that process. For whatever reason, in my spirit's journey and my journey here on earth, I was meant to go through that. When I say I fell apart, I fell completely apart. And a part of me, what kept me going through all of it were my children, and thinking about my grandchildren one day, if my kids have children, I hope. And one of the things that helped me was polyvagal exercises. I seem to have gone into not just a grief place, but it almost felt like some of the experiences that my sister and I had, or things I knew that happened to her that were traumatic, that I was present for, that I witnessed, experienced myself. That fear it feels like been suppressed throughout most of my life. And when she left, it all came out at once. And so now I look back at that time, it was a 2-week period. I look back at that time with a time of love and compassion for myself and what I went through and the people who came to support me, and knowing that we can piece ourselves back together little by little. And so one of those polyvagal exercises, I was doing things intuitively without even knowing. And then I found these exercises and I was like, oh, I'm like practicing polyvagal exercises. One of them is humming, like kind of in the back of your throat, humming. It can be a deep hum, singing. It activates the vagus nerve, and it helps to send a signal to the body that you're safe. You don't have to be scared. Another one is with temperatures, you take ice cubes, you put it on the back of your neck. Like there's all of these things that you can physiologically do to change and help yourself to stabilize. And so a lot of our ceremonies, our lifeways, our belief systems, stories, and teachings are in alignment actually with a lot of the things that science talks about. So I'm really, really grateful for being exposed to these things in my lifetime as a Native woman, and also to be a clinician, to know that healing's possible, even when you fall completely apart, like I did in grief. So somatic healing, some of you may know this, but somatic, again, like I said in the beginning, is just our bodies. And we look at ourselves as not separate from the earth. And so anytime that you feel disconnected, lost, always just go outside, put your feet on the earth, go talk to the trees. I know a lot of people, when you think of that, like back in the 70s, I wasn't born yet, but I remember it because I was born in the 80s. People would be talking about hippies and how hippies would like hug trees and do all this stuff. And I was like, well, I mean, that's kind of like what natives just have always known, that they're relatives to us, like they're relatives. And in fact, during that time when I fell apart after my sister passed away, one of the only things that I knew to do that felt safe was to get a plate of food of things that she liked, and I would carry it out to the tree, and I would make prayers for her spirit's journey back home. And I would talk to that tree because that tree felt safe. It wasn't no person at that point in my journey could have made me feel safe. I had to do that hard work. And it was through nature that I was able to do that. So I want to mention the spirit of resistance. I love this quote, so I'm going to say it out loud. I have a duty to speak the truth as I see it and share not just my triumphs, not just the things that felt good, but the pain, the intense, often unmitigated pain. It is important to share how I know survival is survival and not just a walk through the rain. That's by Audre Lorde. And she wrote in the book, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. And I share this because I feel like it emphasizes the internal experience that I've kind of referred to throughout this process of, whether it's intergenerational pain and healing, or the external things that we balance both. We have to walk in both worlds to create change in this world, the change that we want to see for our next generations, for our grandchildren. This is a picture of, is anyone familiar with Leonard Peltier? Yeah, okay, so Leonard Peltier is a political prisoner activist that was placed in prison for, I think, just shy of 50 years. And he's an amazing person and man. And next to him is my husband. And when he can't travel with me and I'm away from our children and him, sometimes he's out traveling and talking. I think about the work that he does. He practices resistance in a time of oppression. So a lot of our people in Minneapolis recently, a lot of people, period, and a lot of our tribal people who are from sovereign nations, right? We have our own tribal nations, our own enrollment, all of that. Were being taken and placed into these facilities. And so, Nick and his team, amongst many other people, grassroots people in Minneapolis, responded to that immediately, was strategizing and coming together as community and what are your legal rights and doing trainings and all of that. And he really, to me, represents the spirit of resistance. And he gives me strength in that way. We always say we're like yin and yang because I focus a lot on like healing our hearts and our minds, and he does a lot of the like systemic change. So I just wanted to end with that, but I just want to thank you all for, listening to me talk a little bit about culture, my perspectives on healing, given clinical experience, and then also how important it is. I just feel like I'm a really strong advocate until the day I go that healing is an ongoing journey. It never ends. I know that, and I have witnessed it. And I think sometimes as we deepen our healing, we feel a sense of conflict or confusion or fear. But we move through that and we come to find more understanding about ourselves and the world. So thank you so much for being here with me tonight. And I hope to talk with some of you after. I don't know if we have time for
We do have time
okay.
for questions. Thank you so much. Can we all give her a hand? So if you have a question, please go to one of the mics on this side and on this side to ask it. Thank you.
I guess it's me. Thank you very much. And I very much believe in counseling. And am I correct that you would agree that for those different ways of healing you mentioned, the person has to make the decision, I want to heal?
Yes. Yes.
And you mentioned that you were an intervention therapist. Is part of that intervention a gentle confronting the person you need to heal? Or what is an intervention therapist?
Okay. So I might have said intervention. I apologize. I'm an addiction therapist. Yeah, I believe you. Yeah. I apologize. I meant addiction. But actually, intervention is a huge part of the work. Working with families, concerned people. Sometimes it's filing involuntary, commitments if that person is unsafe. But you're right. It is the person wanting to get the help. I do think that there's things that we can do as family members and friends of people we care about to plant seeds and to directly express concern, and putting boundaries up as needed. So we're not enabling, but we're supportive and making it clear to them that we know the difference and that we are here if they need help. It's one of the hardest things to watch people you love go through that and not feel like you can make that decision for them. Yeah.
I just wanted to know whether your parents were a product of those schools and how they would, and the community would keep the culture alive in the face of all of that going on.
Yeah, so my parents did not attend boarding school. My mom, she lost her mom at a very, very young age. And so she was adopted in a traditional way by a Dakota family. And they both have stories of being, and you'll hear this in communities if you talk to like my mom and dad's generation. It was an active knowing that you had to hide all the time because you never knew if some of the officials were coming to take kids. And so they would have to be really careful to be on the lookout for certain cars or buses or things that were coming. Or if someone was like an official, they'd have to run into the house and they had hiding spots to hide so that they wouldn't be taken. So neither of my parents did go to boarding school. But the effects of that down the lineage are definitely, both of my parents didn't have like homes that they grew up in with their biological parents. They were either raised by different people or by grandparents or different things like that. So they were displaced. And so in terms of continuing to practice the culture, I mean, talk about acts of resistance and love and compassion for our lifeways. I forgot to mention this, but in the boarding schools, and Leonard Peltier talks about this. Our organization got to interview him, and his story is going to be available along with all of the other stories that we've recorded across the country. Just want to share this. Once they're all transcripted and all of that, all of these hundreds up to thousands of stories are going to go to the National Library of Congress for public viewing so that they can be used in schools. And so that part of history isn't forgotten. And so during his interview, he talked about his act of resistance. They actually, as little guys, they named themselves the resistors. And so they would speak their language in private, like behind, when they thought no one was around, they would speak in Lakota. Because if they did speak it in front of the nuns or priests or whoever, they would have gotten beaten or, tortured in some way. So those moments of resistance, and then also the ones, our religion and ways of life were illegal until the late 70s. And so we couldn't do any of have sun dances or have our ceremonies without being arrested. That's pretty recent in history to not be able to just practice who we are, but people did them anyway. People continued to hold those ceremonies, but often underground, like actually underground building things, or, at night or in a place that felt secure to do that. And without those ancestors continuing that, we wouldn't have any of that today. There needs to be a lot more. And so I have hope that our younger generations are going to continue to feel connected to their spirit and their culture so that they can continue the work too. Thanks.
Over here.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. Would you mind elaborating just a bit more on your meditative practices with an indigenous or native twist? I'm thinking in terms of in the past, the vision quest, especially for young males, and issues that young males seem to be having these days. The sweat lodge, not the New Age or the Sedona,
Yeah.
but from a native perspective, do you utilize some of those aspects of deep reflection and thoughtfulness about all the beautiful things that you have shared with us this evening, that you have in your repertoire to utilize? Any thoughts or comments on that aspect?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is a interesting experience as a Native person to want to share the beauty of our ways of life, while also knowing that there's a couple dynamics involved with that when you're with other non-Native with non-Native people. And one is that, how do I say this in a way that conveys the sentiment of a lot of our ways have been attempted to be eradicated by colonial powers, right? And so we had to fight to keep them alive, like we just talked about. And so we're very protective over our ways of life because sometimes they're also exploited, right? Kindly, you made reference to Sedona. And so we're really mindful, cautious, proceed with caution about talking about those ceremonies. Number one, they're very sacred. They're very sacred, and I myself don't run ceremonies or anything like that, but I do feel good about talking about them in a way that really highlights that they are very powerful and sacred protocols and experiences for our people to heal. And without them, we wouldn't be where we are today because it helps us move through grief. There's certain ceremonies and protocols for that. You talked about the hamblecha, or people know it as the vision quest, is powerful as a coming of age for people. You know, there's one for boys and girls. And a lot of that is being adapted to within some communities to include our two-spirit relatives, you know, people who identify as being two-spirit. So yeah, there are specific Lakota ceremonies and things, and then there's ones outside of that that other tribes have that they continue to use. And truthfully, like this word mindfulness it's a word that we use a lot, and our ways of life really were mindful. They were mindful of relationship. Like when we use plant medicines like sage or cedar or sweetgrass, we acknowledge and say thank you to that medicine. It's a relative, because without that relative, we wouldn't be able to cleanse and smudge and be together in the same way. So every step of that process, the water and how we pray with intention, like all of those things are a part of being with ourselves and being together in a way where a lot of elders talk about when people come together and have one heart and one mind and they pray in that way together, miracles happen, change happens, healing happens. It's not just a concept, it's a real energy that happens collectively. So yeah, I hope that answers part of it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all of your words, but one thing that you said really resounded with me. And you said, I don't have to be in survivor mode all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if you could maybe elaborate. I mean, you go from your mother and your grandmother and now to you. So there's a span there. And what do you think is it that got you to where you don't feel like you have to be in survivor mode all of the time?
So I didn't realize that I was in what we refer to as survival mode until I was a bit of a ways into my own career. And so when I started to learn concepts, again, I talked about if you have the education awareness, I think sometimes when you have like trauma symptoms or different things like that, it's helpful to have education. You look at that and you're like, oh, hypervigilance. I mean, when I was talking about hypervigilance, I have it. Like everyone in my family, I barely walk around a corner and I've been in car accidents, I've had other things happen to me. And I started to realize, one, like the work I do as a therapist, when you're a therapist, you have to do your own work continuously to be able to hold space for people in like a genuine way. And so I started going to my own therapy, and I had my first therapist was like, you like are oozing, like shame and like your belief systems about yourself, and you're in survival mode. And I was like, me? No, I have it together. I'm a therapist. And then I started, was like, whoa, being constantly exhausted, being on high alert, assuming the worst at every moment, preparing for the worst. I mean, it was how I saw the world and saw myself, was from a place of fear. And so I think there's some grieving that came with that. Like, man, how much of my life did I spend in that place? So there was a bit of grieving, a bit of shame, but giving myself the tools to know that what would I say to another human who was going through this? Apply that to yourself. And I think it just over time, it was paying attention to my breath, paying attention to cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that goes through your body. And when it goes through your body, you can feel lightheaded. You can feel like your heart's beating, tunnel vision. And I started to notice all of those things. And so I was able to catch them, and they still happen. Like they still happen, but it's not anywhere near what it used to be. So I didn't feel like I was living in that constant state. I was able to like talk to myself and be gentle with myself in those patterns and slowly rewire.
Therapist rule of thumb, don't take your practice home with you.
Yes. Yeah.
But you mentioned one thing about the transplants. Here in Denver, we had about 5,000 Native Americans transplant here to Denver, which is kind of an amazing thing. The question I had, let me do a little follow-up. There's a program, it's called 180 Ministries, and they bring together people with addictions, and they literally isolate them from their previous lifestyle, and they live together as a community. And then my second part on that is the fact my niece is half Lakota, and I emphasized to her, she's a program debugger for Oracle, and I said to her, go see if you can find some family. And she found an aunt, and it changed her life. And I asked, what was the big thing getting to know some of your, your relatives? And she basically told me, because I felt like I had family. How do you feel about incorporating family into therapy that you do?
Oh yeah, it's really, really important to be able to have individual therapy is really a powerful tool when someone just needs to be heard from an objective place, right? Like we create narratives within our family systems. We often take on roles within our family systems, you know, and so to be able to go into a space where someone doesn't know you through those contexts, but in my opinion, individual therapy can get you to a certain point. But if there's a lot of issues within the family, it's powerful to have, in the very least, what we call collateral information, which is you're getting information from outside, you know, the mom, the dad, the husband. And so for me, I always invited family or couple, the partner, the spouse into sessions at some point. It was crucial. I mean, to see how they interacted with that person and what came up for them. And really to see that, especially for a lot of youth who would be the identified patient or client who's acting out, is actually holding a lot for the family and feeling a lot and expressing it in a way that may be suppressed from other family members. And so being able to include the family is like always ideal. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Serene, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.